Hi everyone, my name is Leah. I'm a doctoral researcher, which is a fancy way of saying a PhD student. I am doing an attempt at talking to a camera as both an academic and an autistic, because I've got academic experience of public speaking, but I don't have any experience of doing it as an autistic person and doing it authentically and being open. So this is my attempt at that. I posted in the Autism Life for Autistic People group and asked for people to send me questions of things that they want me to answer. And one of them was about knowledge versus understanding. The commenter said something about why is it that when somebody tells me, she's autistic, she said, when somebody tells me a thing, I don't understand it, but I know it, but I don't understand it, and I'm expected to understand it, but they haven't explained it to me. I think that essentially what she's asking is that there seems to be a lot of expectations coming from neurotypical people that if I tell you to do something, or if I tell you the reason for something, that you're going to understand it. And that's not always true. Autistic brains work in a different way than neurotypical brains. And there's a difference in reasoning and logicking and understanding things that can mean that we think outside the box, which can be fantastic, and there's other stuff like just because somebody says something doesn't mean that we aren't going to question it, or that we are going to blindly accept it. And I think this is part of it, is that we don't just blindly accept in the way that neurotypical people do. Studies have shown that autistic people are a lot more resistant to peer pressure, even at a young age. And when peer pressure to smoke, for example, autistic people are a lot less likely to be successfully pressured by their peers to do the thing, whatever it might be, whether that's smoking or something else. I can testify to this in my own life. I can remember many times where my friend was trying to convince our friendship group to go on a night out, and she'd spend like 10 minutes working on each of us trying to convince everybody, and everybody else would buckle and I wouldn't. And everybody else would feel bad about saying no. And I would feel like this much bad, but mostly I wouldn't feel bad because I'm like, no, I told you no in the first place. It's not my fault you wasted your time trying to change my answer. You can't change my answer. I've made up my mind. I'm not going to go. If I was open to my mind being changed, I would have said maybe, and then you could persuade me. But I didn't say maybe. I said no. And I think it's things like that. We are not necessarily going to be sold on something just because somebody else tells it to us. I think as well, that means that we're either more likely to question the motives of somebody else or question the value. We don't blindly accept things, like I was saying. So for example, there was another study I recently read on a similar vein where there was this 11-year-old student, and she was known for asking a lot of questions in class. I relate quite strongly to that. I was the one who was always asking questions, to the point that my report cards would say, Leah questions everything until she understands it thoroughly. And I brought it up with the teacher who wrote it, and I was like, is that a bad thing? And he was like, no, it's a good thing, because if you're asking, then everybody else in the classroom is thinking the same thing, but they're just too polite to ask. I was like, cool. But anyway, so this research paper about the student, she was asking too many questions in class, and her teacher felt that some of the questions were relevant to the content that was being taught and some of them were not, and it was really bugging her, I guess, because tangents would happen when irrelevant questions were asked. And so the teacher took it into her own hands and gave the student a piece of paper that basically said you're allowed to ask 11 questions per class, no more, and you need to record it and you tick off when you've asked one of your questions. And this forced the student to be more frugal with her questioning, and so she kept all of her questions relevant because she knew that she only had a limited amount of attention from the teacher. And the researchers, I guess, considered this to be a successful intervention to correct this student's behavior because it reduced distraction from the class, I guess. But again, that is another example of a time where an autistic person might be told, you're saying too much, you're asking too much, and they don't understand why. and they want to fit in. They want to be obedient as much as any other student does, and they ended up being forced into it. So I think that essentially the difference between knowledge and understanding comes down to we don't blindly follow, we're resistant to peer pressure, and that includes pressure from society to accept things as they are. I personally find that whenever I enter a job or I enter a project or something, I can't help but look for ways to innovate and to improve a system that doesn't work. So when people are talking about all of these flaws in a system, I'm like, yeah, you know what would fix that? This. And they're like, oh, why can't you just leave it alone? Why can't you just get on with it? Why do you have to change things? I'm like, well, if it's broken, shouldn't we fix it? And I think that that is quite common, is like, maybe autistic people just don't see why they should keep their mouths shut when there are problems to be fixed. To the point that, like, I think autistic people don't have the same respect for authority that, for example, a conservative political person might, because I read something that said that conservative people really value authority quite a lot more than liberals do, and they really believe in the system, whereas liberals don't. And I think that in that way, I'm not going to get political because I'm not going to share my political views, but I think that it's a interesting comparison that autistic people are a lot less likely to have that inherent faith and see why I should just trust the system and just trust what you say. I need to understand it for me. And I know that from my memory, at least, like, I don't remember anything if I don't understand it. If you tell me what a recipe is, even if it's like my favorite recipe in the world, I won't remember it unless I'm like, well, why do we need baking soda in there? Why can't we just use self-raising flour? Because self-raising flour does it for you, right? Maybe that's a bad example. I'm not a cook, clearly, but you get my point. So I think it comes down to those sorts of things. We're not as likely to just be blind followers, whereas some other people might take for granted that they just can accept with disinterest anything that somebody tells them. Yeah, I hope that helps.